Hello Girls Planers! Welcome back to another Meet My Commander video. Today we're going to be talking about Grolnok the Omnivore. This is a very special deck to me because my boyfriend made it for me for my birthday last year, and I've upgraded it since, but not only did he buy it for me, he also took the time to build it, and we both love frogs, so this one is extra special. Grolnok the Omnivore is a legendary creature frog. He is a 3/3 that costs 2 colorless, a green, and a blue, and he reads, whenever a frog you control attacks, mill 3 cards. Whenever a permanent card is put into your graveyard from your library, exile it with a croak counter on it, and then you may play lands and cast spells from among cards you own in exile with croak counters on them. If you didn't know, milling is when you take anything from your library and you put it directly into your graveyard. And there's lots of ways to do this, as we will get into. So what Grolnok wants to do is he wants to attack with as many frogs as possible. You want to get frogs out on the board and attack with them. And in the beginning, it doesn't necessarily matter if they're doing a whole lot of damage, if your frogs are small, if the damage isn't going through, because the attack trigger happens no matter what, and it happens before anything else happens. So you will be building basically an open hand of cards that are in exile, which means they're pretty difficult for other players to get to, and you can play them. Now this does exclude non-permanents, so anytime you mill an instant or a sorcery, that's going to go straight into your graveyard. And of course there's graveyard access. We know, especially in blue, how we can get into that. But all of your lands, enchantments, artifacts, creatures, etc. are going to be put into this special bucket in exile that you can then play from. I want to talk about a couple of different lines that you can play in this deck. Let's talk about self-milling. We'll also talk about what a tribal deck means, and then go over some of the cool frog cards that are in here. This deck would be classified as a tribal deck, which in Magic the Gathering means it is focused around one particular creature type. So there's a lot of things that might give particular bonuses to that creature, or there's some general staples that work really well in a lot of tribal decks that have you select a creature type and then gives bonuses to them. For example, Adaptive Automaton is a great staple for tribal decks. This is a 2/2 artifact creature construct that costs 3 colorless mana, and it reads, as Adaptive Automaton enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Obviously we're choosing frog here. Adaptive Automaton is the chosen type in addition to its other types. Other creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1. So this is a great way to buff everything else that is a frog on the battlefield. Another few great staples are Heraldic Banner and Herald's Horn. Heraldic Banner has you choose a color, and then creatures you control of the chosen color get +1/+0. It also allows you to add mana. And then Herald's Horn has you choose a creature type, again choosing frog. And these spells of this chosen type cost 1 colorless less to cast, so it makes it easier to get more frogs out on the board. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. If it's a creature card of the chosen type, you may reveal it and put it into your hand. So it is essentially an extra draw if you happen to have a frog on the top. There are a few cards in this deck that let you see the top card of your library at all times, and you can really use this to your advantage when you're trying to draw or mill things. Another one that I really like is Realm Walker. This is a shapeshifter, and at the top of its abilities it has Changeling, which means this card is every creature type. This is different than choosing a creature type when it enters the battlefield, because this one already is all the creature types, so it already counts as a frog. So if you have any entering the battlefield triggers for frogs coming in, this one will trigger that. As Realm Walker enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may cast creature spells of the chosen type from the top of your library. This is a 2/3 that costs 2 colorless and 1 green. So, as I said, if you're able to look at the top card of your library every time, which is also different than playing with it revealed, you can decide whether you'd like to mill it so that it goes into your croak counter in exile, or perhaps if it's an instant or sorcery, you could choose to not do that so that you might be able to draw it on your next draw step. Next, let's talk about the milling. This is really the primary function of this deck, and a lot of times when you have a mill deck, you're trying to mill other people out, because if you get to your draw step and you cannot draw any cards from your library because it's empty, you lose the game. This one is not about that. This is making yourself mill. It might seem counterintuitive to try to mill your own cards, but in this one, you're really not getting rid of them. Yeah, you're taking a risk that your instants and sorceries will end up in your graveyard instead of pulling permanent cards, but it's a risk that you probably want to take because it is a huge advantage to have a hand of, up to your entire library that you can choose from. And then you just have to pick a line of play that you like and make sure you have enough mana to do it. Here's a couple examples of great cards for this milling. Now, the function of the commander is one that allows you to do this, but there's a bunch of cards in here that help with that. Milliken is a 0/1 artifact creature that taps to put the top card of your library into your graveyard and add 1 mana to your mana pool. This is really helpful because it is a double function. It doesn't necessarily mill a lot of cards at once, but there are some creatures that we will talk about that get bonuses or have a trigger happen whenever you mill something, so any chance you get to do that is great. Plus, this is a mana rock that is not a land. Otherworldly Gaze is an instant that can help you with this. You look at the top 3 cards of your library, put any number of them into your graveyard, and the rest back on top of your library in any order. This also has flashbacks. You can cast it twice if it's in your graveyard. This is a great one because you might end up milling it. So it might be in your graveyard to start with, but 2 mana is not terrible at all for a flashback cost. And this one allows you to order things so that maybe you could put a different instant or sorcery back on the top of your library and all your permanents go to your exile. Hedron Crab is a really nice 1 mana creature that you can get out there early if possible. Having this in your opening hand is awesome. It's a 0/2, so you never really attack with it, but you don't need to. It has landfall, which means that whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, target player, in this case yourself, puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. Another great opportunity to mill things whenever you have lands entering, which is going to be pretty often because in all of that milling, your lands go to exile with the croak counters, and you can play them from there. Now this gets really dangerous when you have something like Willowgeist. Willowgeist is another 1-drop. It's a 1/1, and it has trample. And you think, what's that going to do for me? But whenever 1 or more cards leave your graveyard, put a 1/1 counter on Willowgeist. When it dies, you gain life equal to its power. This happens every single time you put a card from your library into your graveyard. And when you attack with any frogs with Grolnok's ability, that happens 3 times. So you rack up those triggers really fast. This one gets huge, and it has trample and life gain upon death. I like to play it when I have a lot of opportunities already to be attacking with frogs and getting those triggers, so it just grows out of control really, really quickly. Some other creatures that get pretty scary are Froghemoth. I tend to find this one doesn't last very long on the battlefield because it just is so intimidating that people want to kill it as soon as possible. It is a frog horror. It has trample and haste. Whenever Froghemoth deals combat damage to a player, exile up to that many cards from their graveyard, put a 1/1 counter on Froghemoth. For each creature card exiled this way, you gain 1 life for each non-creature card exiled this way. You can see why that doesn't last very long, and it starts as a 4/4. Then there's Pathbreaker Ibex. Now this one's not a frog, but I'm really excited about the cool art version that I have on this. It's a really interesting goat. He's awesome. This one is similar to Craterhoof Behemoth in that it gives all of your creatures a large amount of counters. Pathbreaker Ibex is expensive. It costs 4 colorless and 2 green mana. It's a 3/3 goat creature. Whenever Pathbreaker Ibex attacks, creatures you control gain trample and get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So you can see how that might get scary with something like Willowgeist already on the board and buffed, where you might have a 20/20, and then suddenly all of your creatures get +20/+20 until end of turn. With trample, this is a closer. this is a real game ender. Given the nature of this commander, it's really important that your frogs are able to attack, and a lot of times these are not huge creatures. So here's a couple examples of how you can get them attacking pretty safely without having to be huge. I really like Jade Avenger. This is a small little frog, it's just a 2/2, but it has Bushido 2, which means that whenever this creature blocks or becomes blocked, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Often you're able to turn that into a 4/4 if you're attacking, or even the threat of doing that is enough to make it not be blocked, because they might rather take 2 damage than have a creature take 4 damage. And it doesn't matter, remember, if your damage goes through. It's about the attack trigger. Another great one for this is Whiptongue Frog. Whiptongue Frog is a little guy. Again, he's a 1/3. The 3 is really nice, but it has 1 blue to give it flying until the end of turn. So you can always attack with it, and then at instant speed, make it a flyer at the last minute. Another frog that is super key in this deck is Spore Frog. This one is even more baby, and it only costs 1 green mana, so it's really good to have out there as an emergency situation fix. It has Sacrifice Spore Frog, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. And if someone is going to kill your Spore Frog, you can still sacrifice it at instant speed when you have your turn on the stack. So they still won't be able to do any combat damage this turn. And I've gotten people a couple times with this because they think that by killing Spore Frog, they're going to still be able to do the damage. And sometimes this doesn't end the game in your favor, but it might delay it by 1 turn so you get the chance that you need. Knowing that a really big priority of this deck is creatures are attacking all the time. I love having Beastmaster Ascension in here. This is an enchantment that says whenever a creature you control attacks, you may put a quest counter on Beastmaster Ascension. As long as Beastmaster Ascension has 7 or more quest counters on it, creatures you control get +5/+5. +5/+5 is huge. That is a boon to any creature, any deck at any time. What's special about this is that it's whenever a creature you control attacks. It's not whenever creatures you control attack. So if you have 7 creatures attack at once, you'll get those 7 quest counters immediately, and then they all have +5/+5 right away. Here's a card that I really like to deal with other people's commanders, because a lot of times you end up with a lot of creatures on the board, but your instants and sorceries end up in your graveyard because you've milled them, which is a bummer. Here is an enchantment that is a permanent, so it would stay in your exile croak counter card list. It says enchant creature. Enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a blue frog creature with base power and toughness 1/1. So you turn it into a little baby frog. It's definitely not that difficult to find enchantment removal in a deck, but it is a little less common than counter spells or ways to kill creatures that I have found. So I really like this as a way to turn someone's commander into a cute little frog. Let's talk about the contingency plan for milling yourself out. You don't want to do this, you don't want to lose the game on your own hand, but there's 2 cards in here that basically guarantee that you can't mill yourself out. I would not be worried about it. One of them is Elixir of Immortality, and this is an artifact that only costs 1 colorless mana, and it has 2 and tap it to gain 5 life, shuffle Elixir of Immortality and your graveyard into your library. You can get all those instants and sorceries back. Anything that you had die goes back. Now, it doesn't bring things from exile back, so you don't necessarily have that protection, but if you're really worried, there's always Jace Wielder of Mysteries. Now this guy, he'll win the game for you, and this is a really fun way to win the game, because you're focusing on these frogs, and you're attacking, and you've got all these things out on the board, and then suddenly you find a way to mill 30 cards in 1 turn and then just win the game. He is a legendary planeswalker. He comes in with 4 loyalty counters, and he says, if you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. His +1 ability is target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard, draw a card. Awesome, we love this. And his -8 is draw 7 cards. Then if your library has no cards in it, you win the game. So both his passive ability and one of his active abilities allow you a separate win condition And I think it's really fun to be able to count up your mill counts in the last few stages of a game and just win like this. You'd have to have him for a total of 4 turns before you were able to get this off. So you want to time it right. But sometimes you can mill so many cards that you don't even need to use his ability. So the general overview. Put Grolnok out as soon as possible and start attacking with him. And you want to protect him. If you have any way, which I do have in here, to give him Shroud, to give him Hexproof, to make sure that he doesn't die, that's great. But that really applies to many commanders. You want to get frogs out on the board, as many as possible. You want to attack with them consistently so that you get your line of cards out in your exile with croak counters. And it's important to note that if Grolnok does die, those don't go away. You just can't play them from exile if he's not out on the board. Then you want to find a closing argument. You want to get a really powerful creature. You want to buff everything with something like Pathbreaker Ibex. You want to find that closer that really wins you the game. And if you can't do that, just discard so many cards that you run out and then play Jace and then win. There's so many ways to win. I love frogs. I love this deck. It's so fun to play against people because they just don't see it coming. I think that's something I really enjoy in Magic because I like to think that maybe I'm not a person that you would think is particularly intimidating until I bring out my multiple Simic decks and then, oops, you don't have any life left. Thanks for hanging out with Grolnok, and let me know what your favorite frog cards are. I do have some of the new Bloomburrow ones in here. I didn't choose to highlight them today because they're not huge parts of it. I didn't happen to pull really good frog cards when I was doing my pre-release, and that's where I got all of my Bloomburrow cards from. But in a pack, I did get Nissa Who Shakes the World, and it's the frog art, so I might have to think about putting that in just for the art. This deck is also a joy to play because of the art and some of the flavor text. Here's one of my favorite flavor texts in the entire everything of Magic the Gathering. This is on Chubtoad, and his flavor text is a little poem. It reads, Chubtoad, at the door, run away quick, or you'll run no more. Traditional children's rhyme.